Welcome to the IT Fundamentals Training Series. My name is Mark Haupt, and I am your host. This is episode 23, and today we're going to talk about the external storage connectors. If you missed external storage devices, go back to item 22 or episode 22 before. Join me, episode 23. Welcome to episode 23, the IT Fundamentals Training Series. My name is Mark Haupt, and I am your host through this journey of learning IT functions. As I said in the intro, if you have not already listened to external storage devices that we talked about in episode 22, why don't you push pause right now and head back over there, because this is about external storage connectors. And they kind of play in hand a little bit, because the storage devices are what records the data, but how fast you can get them off those devices depends on this piece here, the external storage connectors. So I'm sure that we're all familiar with the most prevalent external storage connector being the USB. Now, what you need to know for this testing is table 2.1. And what this table shows you are the different versions of USB that exist and when they came into existence and how much speed they can transfer. Now, the speed is the key, not the year. The year, you can forget about it. Just don't even worry about that, okay? But you certainly want to look at the speed of transfer, and we really want to kind of look at this USB 3.0 a little bit more in depth, because the speed there is interesting. All right. So USB 1.1, you can transmit 12 megabits per second. Woohoo! 12 megabits per second. Not very fast. Take a look at that trade name there, just so you're familiar with it. It's full speed, but it's not full speed ahead, because now we have USB 2.0. That's 480 megabits per second. Again, woohoo! 480 megabits. But man, back in the day, when we had USB 2.0, wow, that was a huge speed transfer, especially when you were used to plugging in an analog type of wire that would connect a small disk drive to your computer, and you were running probably less than 12 megabits per second. But that one's called high speed. But then we get into this USB 3.0 options, and it is increased going on up. The transmit speed on USB 3.0 was 5 gigabytes. So we're looking at exponentially larger transfer rate for 2.0 to 3.0. And ironically, it's called super speed. But then we went to 3.0, which was actually not much more than a software or a driver upgrade to get you to that 3.1. And the same thing with 3.2. You went from 5 gigs to 10 gigs to 20 gigs that we can transfer now at 3.2. In fact, I'm very certain that we can do faster than that with some updates. But you're looking at super speed plus, and then they just gave up and they call it USB 3.2 from here on out. So USB 3.1, another important part of that was the fact that it basically replaced FireWires and Thunderbolt cables that were out there. So the key factor there is that we went from using USB ports or USB cables for just small time peripherals like your mouse and your keyboard, things along those lines. Whereas if you needed a high-speed transfer, you were going to use something like a FireWire or a Thunderbolt. Now we've been able to throw away all those Thunderbolt and those FireWire cables, and now we can transmit at extremely high speeds. In fact, higher speeds than Thunderbolts in particular with 3.2. So that is one key thing to look at in Figure 2.1 for your testing purposes. Another thing to take a look at is this SATA, or the internal SATA connectors. These are typically used for external storage devices predominantly. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's what's used. Table 2.2 talks about the SATA specifications. On this one, I don't believe that you have to memorize any of these speeds on here, but just kind of think about it. 1.0, version 1.0 or revision 1.0 is 1.5 gig. Revision 2 is 3, and revision 3 is 6. So it's an incremental increase. You could probably guess on that pretty easily. But I wouldn't really spend a lot of time on the eSATAs. Again, it is predominantly for external hard drives and to be able to do that kind of function there. Then it goes on and talks about the FireWire cables and the Thunderbolt cables, which we have talked about before in a previous episode. Again, with these, probably the thing that you need to take a look at is that FireWire was designed by the folks over at Apple. So it was used with a lot of Apple products initially, and frankly continues to be so on some of their older products. And then the Thunderbolt was supposed to be a USB 2.0 replacement kind of scenario because it was allowing for not only display ports, but also high-speed transfer of things from memory storage devices like SSDs and hard drives. But to be honest with you, it's all moved over to the USB, and that's really where you need to focus your attention there. Now, along with these external storage connectors, we want to look at communications connectors, and this is where we get into some of the network communications, and we'll get more into that in Network Plus and A Plus. What you need to know right now for this is pretty much the difference that they show you in Figure 2.23 and 2.24, and that's the difference between a telephone connector, which is an RJ11, and a RJ45 network connector. And 2.24 really shows you that difference quite clearly. If you look at the one on the left, which has the diagram for the phone, you'll see that there's essentially two little prongs or two little rub points that are up, hanging upwards inside of there. That means that there's the wires that are inside. There's really only two contact points is probably the right answer. Whereas the RJ45 has 8 contact points. And what that does is it allows you to transmit data faster and more accurately. That's only a portion of the process. When we get into A plus, when we get into Network Plus, we'll also talk about how the cables themselves are twisted, and the number of twists and tightness of the twist that's involved will result in data transfer capability. So we're looking at RJ11 and RJ45, and all you need to know is the difference between those two from the perspective of what they look like, and perhaps how many touch points, if you will, or contact points that are inside of those RJ ports, as they say in Figure 2.24. You also need to understand wireless networking a little bit, and the fact that you can use Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or RF or radio frequency for the transmission of wireless networks. Now, typically Wi-Fi is utilized from computer to computer type of scenario, but you can also use Bluetooth. Keep in mind that Wi-Fi is for what I would call medium to longer range type of function. So with long range being within your home or with an office building, Bluetooth is for very short distances, usually less than 10 feet. And then radio frequency is for your extremely long distances, because you can use microwave RF or different types of functions to push those across. So it could be another option is what they call near field communications. And the near field communications are those items that are short range type of stuff. So RF in the book is also looked at in chapter 8. So we'll get to that type of thing a little bit more effectively at that point. All right, moving on to page 92, we're going to take a look at, and I told you we would move through some of these a little faster because they've either already been talked about, or they're so simple that you just need to read the book and memorize a couple of things like that table with RJ11, RJ45. But let's look at input and output devices. And this one is also very simple. Input devices and output devices. An input device is something you're doing to put into the computer, like a keyboard or a mouse. An output device is something like a monitor or a printer. And if you could just simply remember that when they start asking you in a test whether a particular device is an input or an output device, think about how you receive it. Is it an input device where you're actually entering something into the computer with it, or is it an output, you're seeing something or getting something out of it? So when it talks about keyboards here, and the types of ports they use. Most keyboards are using USB or some sort of near field communication wireless type of connection these days. But do read the section and look at figure 2.26 about the PS2 keyboard, and know that that's a DIN 5 type of keyboard. That would be something to keep in mind for your test. And if you're creating flashcards or creating some sort of memory cheat sheet, that would be something that I would write down and make sure that's available. And finally, and we'll wrap this up here after this, but we get into keyboard configuration options. A few years ago, ergonomic keyboards were the big thing. And the figure 2.27, they now call it a natural keyboard or an ergonomic keyboard. And apparently that is to cut down on carpal tunnel syndrome and different types of physical ailments that can occur as a result of spending a lot of time typing on the keyboard or using a mouse. And so what they're showing you there is a natural keyboard. If you've heard the term ergonomic keyboard, it's the same thing, but make sure for the testing purposes that you use a natural keyboard. All right. And then I also want you to take a look at the bottom of page 94, the last paragraph. It talks about QWERTY, QWERTY. And then the QWERTY keyboard, if you look at your keyboard, almost all US-based keyboards these days, the very top row of letters is QWERTY. And so that we always call that a QWERTY keyboard. And those are for Latin-based languages that are out there, and English is a Latin-based language. So that's the type of thing you're gonna see quite frequently. So if they refer to it as a QWERTY keyboard, that is just a standard keyboard that we have that we utilize these days, and you can remember that. All right, I want to encourage you to do the exercises in 2.3 and follow through on that. It will help you get a few extra things, if you will, down and perhaps even looking ahead at exercise 2.4. But this is the end of episode 23, and hopefully you'll have some questions from it. But if not, that's because this is a pretty simple episode here to take a look at. So give me a holler. Send me an email, mhalp@commonsensesecurity.net. I'd love to talk to you and see where you're at in this process. Let me know how things are going. For now, episode 23 is in the books.